Welcome to the fourth and final lecture about how the Nazi Party destroyed democracy. Today, we will examine how the Nazi Party used propaganda methods to manipulate the people into continuing to support the Nazi regime. The first section will examine the definition of propaganda and how it was integrated into the framework of Nazi government. The second section will examine how the Nazi Party controlled the media in order to spread propaganda to the German people. The third section will examine how the Nazi Party used Germany's cultural heritage and the arts as more subtle forms of propaganda. Finally, the fourth section will examine how the Nazi Party used censorship to prevent the German people from accessing any political or social message that went against Nazi ideology. Let's first consider a definition of propaganda. According to Google, propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a political cause or point of view. Within the context of our study, propaganda is what the Nazi Party used to put across their political message and ideology. The man in charge of propaganda was called Joseph Goebbels. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1924 and had been responsible for the media campaign that had propelled Hitler in his rise to power. He was small in stature and had a physical disability that meant he walked with a limp. However, he was highly intelligent and he knew how to use the written word to convey a strong political message and to sway an audience. In March 1933, only 3 months after Hitler became Chancellor, Goebbels set up the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. This was a branch of government specifically designed to use the media in order to control the minds of the German people. The word enlightenment is especially interesting, since the origins of the word comes from a German philosophy movement of the 18th century, which was focused on using rational thought and reasoning to become enlightened or better informed of the world around you. In actual fact, the Ministry of Enlightenment did the very opposite. It closed people's minds to the outside world and prevented them from using their own reasoning to question what they'd been told. This is a German propaganda poster that shows numerous people doing the Nazi salute. Underneath it reads, "Yes, to a greater Germany." This is a typical poster set up by the Ministry for Enlightenment and Propaganda. It was made to promote the unification of Germany and Austria in April 1938, known as Anschluss. The poster was designed to essentially tell the German people that yes, this was the right thing to do and yes, everyone should agree to it without question. Let's now examine the different forms of media that the Nazi Party used. The main method of communicating information was through newspapers, since most people still learnt about world events through reading about them. Therefore, Goebbels closed all rival printing houses and used newspapers to place a Nazi political spin on any world events. He could also conveniently leave out any events that reflected badly on the Nazi regime, or manipulate events so they appeared like victories. The other tool that Goebbels had at his disposal was Hitler's autobiography turned political manifesto, Mein Kampf. Written while imprisoned following the Munich Putsch, Mein Kampf provided a passionate outline of all that Hitler believed. It included his patriotic beliefs that Germany should break the shackles of Versailles to once again become a strong nation. But it is also clearly anti-Semitic and associates the Jewish race with the communist regime of Russia. Interestingly though, within Mein Kampf comes this quote about propaganda. Hitler says that propaganda is a truly terrible weapon in the hands of an expert. Mein Kampf became so popular that it was the best-selling book throughout the Nazi regime. By the 1930s, wireless radios had become more popular and Goebbels therefore decided to use them as another way of spreading propaganda. They were no longer called the wireless and instead were given the name the people's receiver. The Nazi regime would then use the wireless radio to broadcast Hitler's speeches and other key messages. Radios were installed into the factories so that workers had to listen to these speeches while they did their shift. In this sense, there was no way of escaping the Nazi message. This poster shows everyone gathered around a wireless radio and listening to one of Hitler's speeches. The text reads, "All of Germany hears the Führer with the people's receiver." This poster suggests that everyone in Germany wanted a radio so they could hear their Führer. However, many Germans would later recall how they soon got tired of hearing the same messages repeatedly and would zone out of the radio. Finally, cinema was becoming increasingly more popular. Film had certainly been a popular form of entertainment during the Weimar years. Goebbels was able to capitalize on this by producing and showing films that used storytelling to convey Nazi ideology. The most famous propaganda film was called Triumph of the Will, which was released in 1935. This film focused on the Nuremberg Rally of 1934, which was a huge political event that had 700,000 Nazi supporters attend in the audience. The film includes snippets of footage from the speeches made by Hitler and other leading Nazis, which is then intercepted with footage of the military parades that accompanied the event. The overriding message was that Germany would now return to greatness under the Nazi regime. Let's now examine a more subtle form of propaganda by examining how the Nazi regime used arts and culture to manipulate the German people. The definition of culture is that it is the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively, but also the ideas, customs, and social behavior of a particular people or society. Germany had a rich heritage in culture, with much to boast about, and the Nazi regime was keen to capitalize on this. The Nazi regime knew how to use patriotism and a sense of nostalgia. This is when people look back to the past, especially to their own childhoods, and believe them to be happier, simpler, perhaps even purer times. The Nazi regime was very keen to emphasize how the Weimar years had polluted German heritage and spoilt the lives of so many. Those who were old enough to remember the Kaiser years could therefore feel a greater sense of pride when reminded of those days. One way they did this was through classical music, which would be played through the people's receiver. Germany arguably produced the most amount and the most world-renowned classical composers during the 18th and 19th century. You may have heard of some, such as Mozart, Bach, or Beethoven. If you haven't, then you've at least heard their composition as they're used for background music in restaurants, TV shows and adverts. Another subtle form of propaganda came through the workers' strength through joy scheme. This is something you will learn more about when you study Nazi economic policy. The scheme essentially did a prize draw and winners would be given prizes. Many of these were camping trips in the German countryside. They acted as incentives to workers, but also, while on holiday in the magnificent rural landscape, it was also a subtle way of enhancing the pride that ordinary people felt for their country. Finally, the Nazi regime created artwork in classical style. They commissioned artists to paint idyllic scenes of family life, often in a rural setting. This stoked a sense of nostalgia for the days before the smoky industrial factories, whilst also reminding the German people of traditional family values and the beautiful countryside that the Nazi regime sought to protect. This is an example of a piece of Nazi artwork. It is called In the Beginning Was the Word, and was painted by Hermann Otto Heuer in 1937. The title of the painting is the first line of John's Gospel in the Bible and therefore is also an indicator of how the Nazi regime used religious language to paint Hitler as Germany's savior. In this painting, Hitler is making a passionate speech to a small group of people, likely in a beer hall, showing the humble roots of the party. As a result of this type of propaganda, the Nazi regime were able to create a cult of personality around Hitler as the Führer. This is an image that was printed onto a postcard showing how this type of artwork was made available to the ordinary German people, since postcards were a popular way of keeping in touch with family who lived across the country. It is called the standard bearer. A standard bearer was the soldier in a medieval battle who held the banner. Traditionally, a battle was lost if the standard bearer was slain. This resonates the idea that Germany could only continue on victoriously if led by Hitler as Führer. It was a powerful image ahead of World War II. Let's now examine the role that censorship played in the Nazi regime. The Google definition of censorship is the suppression or prohibition of any parts of books, films or news that are considered obscene, politically unacceptable or a threat to security. We encounter censorship here in Britain when it comes to films, games and TV shows that have age-restricted access due to violent or sexual content. However, for the sake of our study, we will be focusing instead on how the Nazi regime restricted any form of media that went against Nazi ideology or could threaten the security of the regime. Try to think of censorship as the opposite side of the coin to propaganda. Whilst propaganda puts out a message for the ordinary people to hear, censorship prevents them from hearing any alternative point of view. One of the first acts of censorship that the Nazi regime performed was in May 1933. They performed a book burning. This was when the Nazi regime raided public libraries and universities and confiscated books by popular Weimar or Jewish authors or any book that contained an opposing political ideology, such as books written by communists. The book burning was very public. Goebbels used it to send out a clear message that the Nazi regime was purging Germany of all the corrupted ideas of the Weimar Republic. The Nazi regime was also quick to remove any Weimar art from public galleries, such as the work of famous artist Otto Dix. Many pieces of art were destroyed. It was also important for the Nazi regime to restrict access to alternative wireless broadcasts. Throughout the 1930s, the Nazis only allowed the German people to listen to state-controlled media on their people's receiver. However, when war broke out in September 1939, they also restricted access to all foreign radio channels. This meant that as World War II progressed, the German people were left in the dark about how well their country was faring against the Allied powers. Finally, the ordinary German people could not go to the cinema to watch any foreign films, including the famous Hollywood movies of the time. Let's now return to our overarching question of how did the Nazi Party use propaganda methods? Firstly, they made propaganda a main priority by creating the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. They then used every method of media at their disposal: newspapers, posters, radio and cinema. They also found more subtle ways of integrating Nazi ideology into culture and art, especially through the use of classical music and pieces of artwork that promoted Hitler as the savior of the nation. Finally, none of these methods would have been successful had they not used censorship to restrict public access to all alternative ideas that threatened their own political security. Thank you for watching. Tune into the seminar that goes with this series of lectures to learn how to apply what you've learnt to a question on how the Nazi Party destroyed democracy in Germany.